Everybody, thank you for coming today. Today is a special colloquium because we're recognizing the winner of the Tien Van de Waal Graduate Student Paper Award, Emily Curran. It's a pleasure to have her here. I didn't have a chance to meet really Tien Van de Waal or overlap when he was here, but for those who are not familiar, he's a famous demographer trained in the classic demographic tradition of Princeton. He was director of graduate studies for many years. He directed the African demography training program for many years. He specialized in the historical demography and the demography of Africa. As Herb Smith describes him in the PSC webpage, he was really interested and really motivated understanding family change and how the social structure of the family keeps changing and evolving. So I think he would be really pleased with Emily's work here that talks about the new and emerging changes in family structure and how what we need to understand. So please help me welcome Emily Curran.
Thank you, Emilio. So my research is really focused on how providing care structures economic inequality. And today in this talk, I'll be focusing on one type of care shock, having a new child. And in this paper, I look at how children shape economic inequality differently within different sex and female and same-sex. So I'll start today's talk by giving an overview of what economic and gender theoretical approaches say about parenthood and inequality. And then I'll introduce my analytic approach that tests the importance of these theories. I use American Community Survey data, so I'll describe why cross-sectional data is the best option available for a study like mine. I'll describe my modeling approach, which includes a series of nested regression models and an analysis that incorporates a new measure I developed of couple-level gendered processes, which I've constructed with occupational. And I'll make the case for the importance of gender mechanisms, showing that gender matters in shaping how couples divide paid labor, even for those without partners. Then I'll end with some future dimensions and lingering questions, and I'm really looking forward to them. All right. So caring for children requires substantial time and resources, and this has been getting a lot of media attention. Children cause career interruptions, disruptions, and are very, very costly to parents. We know this as sociologists and demographers, and of course the parents in the room know this as well. The economic impact of providing childcare is obviously an issue, and it raises really important questions about who this impacts, what is occurring, and how it is operating. And what we do know very clearly is that the responsibility for providing care to children largely falls on mothers in different sex couples. And Pilar Gonzalez-Ponce's work has documented much of this. So here's an example of what this looks like in different sex couples from a paper Pilar published with her colleagues in 2020. On the y-axis here is change in the mom's share of total coupled earnings. So the reference period is 2 years prior to birth. And this line at 0 is the birth of a new child. And what you can see is that partners' earnings are generally pretty similar before the birth of a child. But once a child enters a family, the mom's share of earnings declines sharply and stays lower than her pre-parenthood earnings for over 8 years. And this pattern has been replicated across many other studies, showing that after the birth of a child, partners' relative amounts of paid and unpaid labor change pretty dramatically. So after a baby is born, the father typically specializes more in paid work, and the mother typically specializes more in unpaid work, as she is providing the vast majority of care to the new baby. And we can call this pattern a parenthood specialization penalty, where the distribution of paid and unpaid work within couples becomes more unequal after the birth of a child. So why does this happen? Parenthood specialization penalties have been explained in two primary ways. So there are economic explanations and gender explanations. And economic theorists have explained that parenthood increases specialization because new children increase childcare and housework demands and create time constraints. So when this occurs, the partner who had fewer relative resources before the child arrived, because they maybe had lower earnings potential, for example, has less power to bargain their way out of undesirable care. And this partner with less of a comparative advantage in paid work should do more unpaid labor and less paid labor when the child arrives. According to economic theories, this would be regardless of the partner's gender. But gender theorists, in contrast, really reject this idea that specialization is gender neutral, arguing instead that specialization is deeply driven by gender. Parenthood coerces women into doing the majority of care labor because of gendered expectations and structural constraints, regardless of how much money she earned. And to varying degrees, research has found support for both of these processes, though I think the evidence is a little bit more stacked in favor of gender mechanisms. But this research, however, is focused primarily on different sex couples and has ignored same-sex couples, a rapidly growing population. So this figure shows the total number of same-sex coupled households in the US. And since 2008, the total number of same-sex couples has more than doubled, growing from just over 500,000 to 1.2 million couples in 2021. And this growing population gives us a really incredible opportunity to advance our theoretical understandings of parenthood. Because these couples were operating under different economic and gendered circumstances. And examining same-sex couples provides really rich empirical leverage to evaluate how children relate to specialization in a context where heteronormative expectations about breadwinning and caregiving may be weak. And our existing economic and gender frameworks provide reasons to suggest that parenthood penalties might be different for same-sex and different sex couples. Okay, let's start with what economic theories would suggest. So again, the core idea with economic theories is that parenthood penalties should vary according to partners' relative resources pre-parenthood. And this means that parenthood penalty differences should depend on whether the characteristics that shape the relative distribution of power within couples are more concentrated in different sex couples versus same-sex couples. And there are two buckets of characteristics that are expected to matter according to economic theories. So the first are characteristics that directly shape partners' bargaining power. And the second are characteristics that are more indirectly tied to bargaining power, but nevertheless are shown to incentivize specialization in the existing literature. So characteristics that directly shape bargaining power include age and educational homogamy. And these are characteristics that signal relative resource differences within couples. And according to economic theories, couples with larger age or education differences should experience larger parenthood penalties than couples with smaller age or education differences. And because these differences suggest larger economic inequalities within couples prior to the birth of a child. So in the case of education, economic theories would argue that the partner who is less educated would take on a greater share of the care labor post-birth, regardless of their gender, because lower educated partners have less earnings potential and are therefore have less bargaining power than their higher educated partners. Same-sex couples are less likely than different sex couples to be age and educationally homogenous. And under an economic framework, these compositional differences would suggest larger parenthood penalty gaps for same-sex couples. And other characteristics like education, marital status, and racial homogamy do not directly signal relative resource inequalities within couples in like a strictly economic framework, but there are still factors that can incentivize couples to specialize. So couples who are married, for example, experience greater parenthood penalties than couples who are not married, because marriage is a legal and institutional arrangement that facilitates mutual obligation between partners. Different sex couples are more likely to be married and racially homogamous than same-sex couples, but are less likely on average to have at least one college-educated partner. And together, these compositional differences suggest the opposite prediction, that under an economic framework, they would imply smaller parenthood penalty gaps for same-sex couples. And gender theories propose a different set of reasons for why parenthood penalties may vary between same-sex and different sex couples. So again, the core idea from gender theories is that specialization is not gender neutral. Instead, gender theories argue that couples' divisions of paid and unpaid labor are shaped by structural forces that reinforce gendered expectations of male breadwinning and female caregiving. And this means that parenthood penalty differences between same-sex and different sex couples should depend on couples' exposure to these heteronormative gendered expectations and structural constraints. And there are two main pathways that can help us measure the exposure to these heteronormative gendered forces. So the first is the gender makeup of couples, and the second is about gendered processes within couples. So first, gender theories suggest that the same bargaining and compositional characteristics, such as age gaps, education, and marriage, that incentivize specialization will have a stronger impact on different sex couples than for same-sex couples. And this is because gender inequality is more structurally enforced within different sex relationships. And as a result, gender theories would predict smaller parenthood penalty gaps for same-sex couples. But in addition to the gender makeup of couples, gender theories further suggest that gendered processes within couples can shape parenthood penalties. Gendered processes refer to the institutional and situational ways that gender is constructed, negotiated, and organized within couples. Gender theories emphasize how the gender order not only organizes inequality on the basis of sex categories, but also according to masculinities and femininities, where masculinity is placed higher on the gender hierarchy than femininity. And therefore, if partners' gendered positions differ, relational inequalities within couples may be greater compared to those where partners' gendered positions are more similar. And this is expected to matter a little bit more for same-sex couples than for different sex couples, because the gendered positions of partners in different sex couples are typically organized along male and female sex categories. And there's some existing research showing the importance of gendered positions within So one study found that within same-sex couples, partners whose gendered positions were signaled to be more feminine took on a greater share of caregiving tasks, such as planning and feeding, compared to their partners with more masculine gendered positions. And taken together, this suggests that differences in parenthood penalties between same-sex and different sex couples may depend on same-sex partners' relative gendered positions. So when partners in same-sex couples occupy more gendered positions, their parenthood penalties should look more like those of different sex couples. But for same-sex couples where partners' gendered positions are more similar, the parenthood penalties might differ from those of different sex couples. And economic and gender theories also suggest that there may be variation within same-sex couples between male and female same-sex couples. So as I mentioned, for differences between different sex and same-sex couples, economic theories also suggest that parenthood penalty differences between male and female same-sex couples will be driven by the concentration of characteristics within couples that shape partnership. So male and female same-sex couples differ on several of these characteristics. For example, male same-sex couples are more likely to be educationally homogamous, but less likely to be racially homogamous or married than females. And gender theories, however, suggest that parenthood penalties would vary between male and female same-sex couples because men and women face distinct gendered expectations surrounding paid work and caregiving. Supporting this, there is research showing that both partners in female same-sex couples intend to be caretakers of new children, which would imply larger parenthood penalties for male same-sex couples compared to female same-sex couples, according to gender theories. In addition, gender theorists have shown that men and women differ in their proximity to hegemonic masculinity. And as I explained to my undergrads, hegemonic masculinity can be thought of as like the real man in our collective imaginations. And there is research showing that gay men can access certain social benefits when their gender performances follow conventional norms. Therefore, men and male same-sex couples greater access to these benefits may create larger relational inequalities within male same-sex couples compared to female same-sex couples. But in comparison, female same-sex couples cannot access the benefits of hegemonic masculinities, and hegemonic femininities do not typically allow women to gain power. And this would predict that we would likely see larger parenthood penalties in male same-sex couples, where the partner who has a more feminine gendered position and holds less relational power would take on a greater share of the feminized caregiving labor. And before I discuss how I'll be testing these approaches, I want to just highlight what we know so far about parenthood penalties. So as I said at the beginning, most of what we know about parenthood and the division of labor comes from studies on different sex couples. And these studies typically find low levels of specialization in couples without children, with maybe a slightly higher share of the couple's total paid work being done by men. And economic theories would say that if the man has more relative resources before parenthood, once a child arrives, then the woman would be doing more care work and less paid work. But if it were the reverse, and the woman had more relative resources before parenthood, then the man would be doing more care work and less paid work after a child arrived. And gender theories would say that no matter who had more resources before parenthood, the woman would be doing the majority of care work and the man would be doing the majority of paid work following the birth of a child. And again, that's pretty much what we see in the existing literature. And there's also been some scattered quantitative studies looking at specialization differences between different sex and same-sex couples, but they don't examine changes by parental status. And these studies find that on average, same-sex couples are less specialized than different sex couples, and female same-sex couples are even less specialized than. But again, we know very little about what's going on over here. And this is kind of what I hope to contribute in this study. And there's, again, some scattered literature that has begun to provide clues about what we might expect. So, for example, qualitative work has shown that female same-sex couples with children divide labor more equally, but the focus has been entirely on unpaid work, and no comparison has been made here to different sex couples. And panel studies from outside of the US find that female same-sex couples experience parenthood penalties, but they are smaller than that of different sex couples. However, these studies only consider earnings, not the distribution of hours worked, which may be a better signal for time available for caregiving. And their focus is exclusively on female same-sex couples. So in this study, I examined the population level associations between parental status and the division of paid work in same-sex couples. And I asked, how does parenthood shape paid work specialization among male and female same-sex couples in the US? And to what extent do economic and gender mechanisms underlie the observed difference? I'm going to walk you through the methods I used to answer these questions. So I answer these questions using cross-sectional data from the American Community Survey. The ACS is a nationally representative household survey that gathers information about the demographic and employment characteristics of all members of the household. And my analytic sample consists of 1.6 million couples aged 25 to 54, where at least one partner has non-missing and non-zero earnings from wages and salaries. There are obviously drawbacks to examining parenthood with cross-sectional data, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. But the primary advantage of using ACS data as opposed to panel surveys is a large visibility of same-sex couples. And in my study, I have about 26,000 in my analytics. My dependent variable is hours worked specialization, and I follow prior research by measuring specialization as a share of total couples' hours worked contributed by the higher working. So a couple that fully specializes in paid work would have a value of 1 and would look something like this. Basically, there would be only one working partner. And a couple that divides paid work equally would have a specialization value of 0.5. And they would look something like this, where both partners are working the exact same number of hours each week. I identify same-sex and different-sex couples using ACS's spousal locator, which records the line number of each respondent's spouse or unmarried partner. And I classify couples as same-sex if both partners are men or women, and different-sex if one partner is a man and woman. And I define parents as couples who live with at least one of their own children under 18. So I examine how specialization differences by parental status vary between different sex and same-sex couples and how they're shaped by economic and gender mechanisms. And I assess economic mechanisms by adjusting for characteristics that directly capture partners' relative resource differences and those that indirectly capture partners' relative resource differences, but still nevertheless incentivize specialization. Bargaining characteristics include age and educational homogamy. And my other compositional characteristics include racial homogamy, marital status, and whether a couple has at least one qualified partner. And gender mechanisms are assessed in 2 ways. So the first is through interaction terms that test whether these characteristics shape specialization by parental status differently for different sex and same-sex couples. And the second tests gender processes within couples through same-sex partners' relative gender positions. And I create this measure using an occupational process. So I classify same-sex couples with relatively different gender positions as those where one partner works in an occupation that is more masculine signaled and the other in an occupation that is more feminine. And to do this, I categorize occupations into those that do and do not signal nonconformity. So occupations that signal gender nonconformity are those that fall within the top 20% of masculinized or feminized occupations based on the year-specific distribution of all other sex employed individuals ages 18 to 64 in the ACS. And you can think of nursing as an occupation that would signal gender nonconformity among men, and truck driving as an occupation that would signal gender nonconformity for women. And in these analyses, I restrict my sample to dual earning couples because gendered signals can only be measured among those with valid occupation codes. And I know that this is a less than ideal way to measure gendered processes, but there is some existing research showing that occupation can reasonably proxy gender presentation. So Acker, for example, theorizes that organizations are gendered and help produce gendered components of individual identity. In later quantitative research, Danny Schneider used occupational gender composition to examine how gender signals shape compensatory housework time. And Carrington has used occupational gender composition to describe gender presentations ethnographically of men and women in jobs. And I also find evidence that this is the case in the data. So here I've pulled in information from the 2024 GSS, where respondents were asked how feminine and masculine others perceived them. And these descriptive results show that men in more feminized occupations report being seen as more feminine than men in more masculinized occupations. And the reverse is true for women, although the association is somewhat weaker. And of course, an occupation-based proxy of gendered processes may also influence paid work specialization through occupational pathways. And I've addressed this possibility with extensive sensitivity analyses that I'll touch on later, but I'm also happy to discuss more. So my analytic approach involves a series of nested OLS regression models that estimate differences in paid work specialization between different sex and same-sex couples with and without children. And my analyses focus on how parenthood shapes labor supply specialization differently across couple types, and again, on these economic and gender mechanisms that track the difference. So I start by estimating a baseline model that examines differences in hours work specialization for different sex and same-sex couples with versus without children. And the model can be written like this. And I refer to this interaction term, beta 3, as the parenthood penalty difference. And a negative beta 3 would indicate that specialization gaps by parental status are smaller for same-sex couples than for different sex couples. And I include year fixed effects in this model, but no other controls. And next, I test economic mechanisms by adjusting the baseline model first for bargaining characteristics like age and educational homogamy, and second for other compositional characteristics like marital status, education, and racial homogamy. And I add these variables to the model as controls, but I also include an interaction term with parental status. And my approach here speaks to how economic theories suggest that variation in pre-parenthood relative resources should increase specialization at parenthood, regardless of the gender of each parent. And then to test gender mechanisms, I start by adding interactions with couple type on bargaining and other compositional characteristics. So here, beta L would capture variation by couple type and the impact of characteristics like marital status, for example, on hours work specialization. And beta M would indicate whether marriage is associated with specialization by parental status differently for same-sex versus different sex couples. And next, I re-estimate the full model sequence to examine whether parenthood penalty differences vary within same-sex couples, between male and female same-sex couples. And lastly, I examine the impact of gendered processes on parenthood penalty differences. And here I build on my fully interactive model to examine whether parenthood penalty differences vary within male and female same-sex couples according to their relative gendered positions. And again, this analysis is restricted to dual learning couples. Throughout, I'll be presenting predicted parenthood penalty differences between same-sex and different sex couples, which I estimate using marginal means. And that's helpful because it helps easily interpret parenthood penalties, especially in these later models where I include several triple interaction terms. And I'm going to walk you through some of the descriptives first. Okay, so like we know from previous literature, we're seeing that different sex couples are more specialized on average than same-sex couples. So in different sex couples, the partner who works more hours each week contributes 68% of the couple's total labor supply on average, whereas in same-sex couples, this partner contributes 62% of the couple's total labor supply. And we can also see descriptively that both same-sex and different sex couples with children specialize more than those without children. And we can see also that this gap by parental status is slightly smaller for same-sex couples than for different sex couples. So for example, same-sex couples experience a 4 percentage point difference in hours worked specialization between those with and those without children, and I refer to this gap as the parenthood penalty. And in contrast, different sex couples experience a 5 percentage point penalty, and this 1 percentage point difference between different sex and same-sex couples is the parenthood penalty difference. And it suggests that, again, at least descriptively, parenthood has a stronger impact on specialization for different sex couples than for same-sex couples. And we're also seeing that different sex and same-sex couples differ in their concentration of bargaining characteristics and other compositional characteristics in the ways that we would expect given the existing literature. So for example, different sex couples are more likely to be educationally homogamous than same-sex couples, which is consistent with prior research. And before we look at the results of interest, again, just to remind, like I'm interested in filling these gaps by examining how parenthood shapes specialization for different sex, female same-sex, and male same-sex couples. And I'm going to start by showing results that look at same-sex couples as one. So overall, we see less of a difference in hours work specialization for same-sex couples by parental status than for different sex couples. And these bars represent the percentage point difference in paid work specialization between couples with and couples without children. And again, this model only includes year effects. And the results show that all couples with children specialize more in paid work than couples without children. So for example, different sex couples with children have a 5.6 percentage points more hours work specialization than different sex couples without children. And same-sex couples experience significantly smaller parenthood penalties compared to different sex couples. These couples have a 4.1 percentage point parenthood penalty in hours work specialization, 1.5 percentage points lower than that of different sex couples. And to test economic and gendered explanations of this 1.5 percentage point observed difference, I'll be sequentially adjusting this baseline model. So for reference, I've plotted that 1.5 percentage point parenthood penalty in model 0. And to test the possibility that this observed difference in parenthood penalties between different sex and same-sex couples is related to compositional factors that differ in prevalence across couple types and therefore differentially shape their probability to specialize, which would be suggested by economic theories. I adjust the baseline model first for bargaining characteristics, including age and educational homogamy, and their differential impact on specialization by parental status. And this, the addition of bargaining characteristics in model 1 does not meaningfully change the estimate. However, adding other compositional characteristics in model 2 increases the observed parenthood penalty difference, but not by a significant amount, to 2.1 percentage points. And this change is primarily driven by education, which is reflected descriptively, where perhaps counterintuitively, I find that same-sex couples with children are actually more negatively selected on educational attainment than different-sex couples with children. And taken together, compositional factors do little to explain parenthood penalty differences between same-sex and different-sex couples, which provides little support for economic explanation. And next, I examine whether the gender makeup of a couple may moderate their specialization gaps by parental status. And to test this, I add interactions with couple type on each parameter to examine whether bargaining characteristics or other compositional characteristics shape specialization by parental status differently for same-sex and different-sex couples. And there are no changes when couple type interactions are included on bargaining characteristics in model 3. However, when interactions are added to other compositional characteristics in model 4, the parenthood penalty difference is reduced by 0.8 percentage points. And this represents a 43% reduction from model 2, suggesting that the gender mechanisms motivating these interactions have slightly more explanatory power than the simple economic mechanisms. But again, because significant parenthood penalty differences remain, variation within same-sex couples might reveal its underlying drivers. So again, parenthood specialization penalties may differ between male and female same-sex couples due to compositional differences and the ways gendered expectations for men and women might interact with their incentives to specialize. So I find evidence that parenthood specialization penalties differ for female same-sex couples and male same-sex couples relative to different sex couples. And my results show that the parenthood penalty difference between same-sex and different sex couples are entirely driven by female same-sex couples. So for example, in the baseline model 0, female same-sex couples have a 2.4 percentage points smaller parenthood penalty than different sex couples. And there appears to be very little change in the magnitude of this gap across models. And after all adjustments in model 4, parenthood penalties for female same-sex couples remain over 50% smaller than those for different sex couples. And in comparison, we do see some movement across models for the parenthood penalty difference between male same-sex and different sex couples. So for example, the baseline model showed no significant parenthood penalty difference between men and male same-sex couples and different sex couples, and this remains the case when bargaining characteristics are introduced in model 1. However, when other compositional characteristics are introduced in model 3, the parenthood penalty gap increases from 0.1 to 1.3 percentage points, making the penalty significantly smaller for male same-sex couples than for different sex couples. And this gap is explained by the addition of couple-type interactions on bargaining characteristics. And the gap reduces even further when couple-type interactions are added to other compositional characteristics. And taken together, these findings indicate that the economic and gender mechanisms motivating these analyses do less to explain parenthood penalty differences between female same-sex and different sex couples than between different sex and male same-sex couples. And again, to understand further why parental status has a differential association with hours work specialization for male same-sex couples relative to different sex couples, I take a closer look at these gendered processes. So in this analysis, I classify same-sex couples as having relatively different gendered positions if one partner works in an occupation that signals nonconformity while the other does not. And again, because this requires information on both partners' occupations, I restrict this analysis to lower incomes. My results show that the observed parenthood penalty similarities between different sex and male same-sex couples shown in the last slide are driven entirely by male same-sex couples whose partners have relatively different gender positions. So while dual earning different sex couples experience a 1.7 percentage point parenthood penalty in hours work specialization, male same-sex couples with relatively different gendered positions experience a larger penalty of 2.5 percentage points, which is nearly double that of different sex couples. So this difference is not statistically significant. But male same-sex couples who have relatively similar gendered positions experience parenthood penalties of just 0.7 percentage points, which is significantly smaller than both male same-sex couples who do have relatively different gendered positions and different sex couples. Parenthood penalty differences between different sex and female same-sex couples are also concentrated among female same-sex couples who have relatively similar gendered positions, though unlike male same-sex couples, there are no significant differences between those that do and do not have relatively different gender positions. And I find that these results are pretty robust. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the sensitivity analyses that I've done to test the robustness of these results by gender positions. So here I just copied my main estimates for reference in this top row, and in brackets are the confidence intervals. And again, I find no significant differences in parenthood penalties for female same-sex couples between those who do and do not exhibit relatively different gender positions. But I do find significant differences for male same-sex. So one possibility is that these results are driven really by occupational characteristics that are correlated, as we know, with masculinized and feminized occupations, and not something about gender processing. So to start, I adjust this main model for the wage characteristics of both partners, and I do this in a few different specifications. But I find essentially no change in these estimates. And next, I take a look more specifically at occupational characteristics. So I adjust this main model for both partners' occupations, industries, and a measure of each partner's occupational prestige. And again, I find really remarkably similar estimates even after controlling for all of these occupational characteristics. Though I will say the p-value here decreases slightly in models that control for industry. But overall, these sensitivity analyses really increase my confidence that my occupation-based measure is like picking up something real about gender. And what we're seeing is that gender processes play a really important role in shaping parenthood penalties for male same-sex couples, which offers further support for gender mechanisms. And it indicates that differences in parenthood specialization patterns between same-sex and different sex couples vary both by the gender makeup of same-sex couples and by how gender is operating within these couples. And this is really important because it implies that parenthood penalties are not necessarily a consequence of parenthood in and of itself, but instead about the gendered conditions and environment where parenthood. So to summarize, I find that all couples with children specialize more than couples without children. The penalties are largest in different sex couples and male same-sex couples, and smallest in female same-sex couples. And I find that the parenthood penalty similarity between different sex and male same-sex couples is driven by male same-sex couples where one partner's gendered position is signaled to be relatively more masculine and the other more feminine, as proxied by occupational information. So this paper is still really ongoing. I'm currently working on some supplementary models to help address selection concerns. Obviously, we know parents are a selected group, and same-sex couples may be even more selected because we know these couples often face really costly barriers to becoming parents. And I'm exploring some matching techniques that I hope will help with bias. I also hope to examine parenthood penalty variation by child age and by couples' pathways into parenthood, whether it be marriage, adoption, or through. And again, I'm happy to chat more about these if you're interested. To conclude, my results underscore the enduring importance of gender in structuring how the division of paid labor varies by parental status, even outside the context of different sex couples. And these findings challenge assumptions that specialization is an inevitable consequence of increased caregiving responsibilities, showing instead that large penalties arise under specific heteronormative gender conditions. And my hope is that as this population of same-sex couples with children grows and as our data improves, future research can draw from longitudinal data to examine how these penalties evolve over time in a wide range of queer families. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions, comments?
Yes, I have another question. Maybe this is stuff you want to do next. So I wondered about the two things you had on your next to your bullet list. Is biological relationship to the child and basically pathway to parenthood.
Yeah.
Which, multiple pathways, how same-sex partners can parenthood. And I wonder whether, anyway, kind of both one, just being your own child and the biologically related is a driving factor. And the other one is if one partner brings the child into the relationship, does that dominate? Or anyway, I think there's sort of interesting dynamics to play up that, further kind of, tease that apart. If you have some initial findings.
Yeah, so I don't have initial findings for you at this moment. The one complication with doing these parenthood penalty variations by pathways into parenthood is that the ACS only asks about the relationship of the child to the household head. And so I can kind of get at, I can proxy some of these pathways, but oftentimes we know, especially with same-sex couples in certain restrictive states, that they're even if both partners transitioned into parenthood together, one partner would have to do a second parent adoption to have this couple. And we would think that the adoptive pathways might be different than a biological pathway. And so it's hard to tease out, again, those possibilities. But we do know that in previous research, parents in same-sex and female same-sex couples that had an adopted child tend to view like housework as different than those in different sex couples, where the partner who where the biological partner would do more housework to kind of gain power over parenting decisions. So I'm eager to see what this looks like, but it's kind of imperfect because of these data limitations. Yeah.
The other thing about, the whole term penalty to me suggests that like working is what we all want to do versus actually like being with our kids. I'm curious, so do you have anything about like the occupational happiness? Because I can see how like some cases you might not like totally enjoy your corporate grind and think about, cutting back on your work hours when you have kids.
Yeah, so I think that it brings up interesting ideas about like our individual choice in this matter. But I think what I'm trying to highlight in this paper is that specialization is not necessarily about choices, but about kind of these like structural conditions that parents operate within. And we know in other research that these specialization gaps after parenthood contribute to like long-standing economic inequality. And in different sex couples, this can result in like mothers having less retirement, Social Security at the end of their careers. So those are kind of things that I'm grappling with. But I do think, obviously, we know that occupational characteristics matter in how parents think about their labor after parenthood, whether it's like one partner has a more flexible job or one partner has better access to leave. So those are, again, possible.
So I was kind of thinking like if you have certain occupations where there's better leave access, then like and those are gendered, that would might explain some of the way you're doing.
Yeah, and we know that when we do cross-national research in European countries, we see much smaller variation. Yeah,
Great work. This is amazing. I was wondering what did with the people who were out of the labor. Because precisely that indicates a lot on like prestige scale, sake of things.
So I include all of these results are at the couple level, and I include couples where there's at least one partner as non-missing and non-zero labor earnings. So if couples have one working partner and one not working partner, they're included in my data. I don't include couples where both partners are not working because, like, on one hand, you might think that that is a completely unspecialized couple, but I think those labor dynamics are like different than, that's not, first of all, that's not typical. And also I think those labor dynamics might imply something else. So I exclude those couples. But in that gendered processes model, I only keep couples when partners are working because I need that occupational information to construct that sensitivity. But if I have done models where I'm like, we know that if there's one working partner, that kind of does signal something gendered about the,
Exactly.
you know, like, and so, and obviously though, that is like correlated with my dependent variable. And, but when I do look at it that way, I see bigger gaps than I see with just the party relationships.
I think it would be interesting to have on the system, those.
Yeah.
You know, like to have precisely those.
Yeah.
Are out. I mean, not both.
Yeah.
But well, yeah, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much for this talk. It's really interesting work. I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about what's going on with female same-sex couples. Like, what can that tell us about the role of masculinity, or what theory has to say about why they're the exception?
So I think the reason female same-sex couples like have such dramatically different patterns and like it's robust across many specifications is because of this hegemonic masculinity component. I think relational inequalities are more likely in couples where one partner can have access to some of those relational gains. And we know that masculinity is constructed in part by like domination or by domination over femininities. And so that implies a relational inequality component within male same-sex couples, where those who have like greater proximity to hegemonic masculinity just by virtue of their sex category may allow for more inequality within male same-sex couples. And we also know, for example, that men in general experience greater penalties for gender nonconformity. So I think those are partly things that are going on. And I think there's some also research that suggests that female same-sex couples are just in general more interested in equality, and that's a little bit more of like a gender ideology that they really subscribe to. I think it's a little bit more about hegemonic masculinity. Yeah. Yes.
So I was thinking a little bit about the selection because you are comparing here same sex and different sex, right? So to be a same-sex couple in Philadelphia is very different to be in other cities. So I was wondering if you maybe can do some kind of like sample selection to try to get rid. I know you're using cross-section, you cannot like fix effects, but maybe use a sample for, let's say, more liberal, more open cities instead of using maybe other places that people are more close to this kind of relationship. Because then you're comparing everybody that is married and have different sex in places that maybe are more conservative, comparing to people that are same sex and are more likely to live in places that are more progressive. This is what I was thinking. And the other thing is about, I mean, as an economist, I need to think about the econ side. And relate to the first one, the first question is that the childbearing is basically the huge effect for women, right? So after the first, second year, you have like this big dip of women and they start going back. So I think anything that you can kind of describe, maybe, I think when you mean age of child, maybe compare within same-sex couples, but they have maybe, I don't know, adolescent and a child, that could be very nice to see because I would expect like, I just want to not have the childbearing penalty. I just adopt someone who is 7 years old, 8 years old. So anything like that, and I think probably you already thought about it. That would be my two comments to kind of relate to the econ literature that kind of say, oh, look, the first 2 years, 3 years is horrible. And then the woman goes back, of course, still there's a gap, but the first years are horrible.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. And I do see that these like parenthood penalties are concentrated among those with children, those same-sex couples with children under 6, which again implies something about our childcare arrangements in the US and where those care responsibilities might be greatest. And to your first point, I think that's an interesting thought. There was recently a paper published by Kelly Music and our colleagues that look at variation just among different sex couples in these like specialization patterns depending on regimes of structural sexism. And they find that these specialization patterns are like much greater in places where there's like large levels of structural sexism. And I think that could kind of, you might be getting at some part of that comparison by looking at places where we think would have less just like broader structural inequality. So I think that's a good suggestion.
Just in addition to that, because I have a friend that did something on childcare, maybe you can also do some kind of effect by childcare costs. So maybe if I have childcare costs, this can kind of get rid of some of the omitted bias on choosing to be a father on where I live.
Yeah, that's also a great suggestion. I think that childcare data is complicated when I have cross-sectional data, but it could help tease out some of these things. Yeah.
What is the likelihood of having a child similar to male and female same sex?
So it's a little bit higher for female same-sex couples, because those folks are like much more interested, much more likely, especially in my data, to have had a child in a previous different sex partnership, and then now are like cohabiting with a female partner.
Because I was thinking of whether that some of that was driving the lines of having.
Yeah.
Thanks for very thorough patient. I love how you use patient as a proxy for understanding the gender dynamics within same-sex couples. But then I was wondering, are there structural differences between feminine and masculine patients in terms of income, there were sort of more flexible hours, possibility of working half-time? That makes it kind of difficult to separate gender versus economic factors in your analysis. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that I've been really hesitant to I've been really hesitant in these gender processes measures precisely because of that, because I know that these characteristics with masculinized and feminized occupations are really correlated with occupational pathways. And so part of what I was showing here was some of these like attempts to tease out these processes. So like starting in model 2, I'm adding these controls for both partners' wages, both partners' occupations and industries, and then like occupational prestige. And my thought would be that if these occupational pathways are driving my results that I'm seeing by gender processes, my associations would be eliminated when I'm like adding all these extra things into the model, especially because these are already my samples in these cells are pretty small anyways. And so you could think that they're already like potentially sensitive. And I really see pretty remarkably similar estimates, even as those things are included. But of course, like there might be some occupational pathways that I'm not fully capturing. And I kind of take this as like gendered suggestive, where I'm seeing what I think is something very gendered about these processes in male same-sex couples, and it maps on pretty well with the literature on men